If you love intense HFY stories where humanity turns fear into strength, hit like and subscribe so you never miss the next battle. Your support helps this channel bring you more powerful sci-fi stories full of emotion, strategy, and unforgettable human moments. The royal palace of Vyrlia did not sound like a place of power when the alarms began. It sounded like a living thing waking in terror. Crystal corridors that had held music an hour earlier now flashed with red security light. Ceremonial banners shook under the force of lockdown shutters. Servants ran barefoot across polished floors while armed royal guards sealed every archway with rifles raised and faces pale beneath their silver helmets. Somewhere inside the palace, the child heir of the Vyrlian crown had vanished from a room protected by 6 blood-sworn guards, 3 biometric seals, and a royal security system that had never failed in 200 years. Princess Leora was 8 years old, too small for the golden cloak she had worn at the treaty ceremony, and too important for the palace to admit that no one knew where she was. Lord Marshal Cale Thorne stood in the nursery wing with his hands clenched behind his back, staring at the empty bed as if discipline alone could force the child back into it. The room had no broken window, no burned lock, no forced panel, no sign of struggle except one overturned silver cup and a small moon-shaped toy lying on the floor beside the wrong side of the bed. Cale's jaw tightened. "Show me the last corridor feed." A technician obeyed with shaking fingers, and the air filled with a blue security projection. The image flickered once, then showed a tall human officer moving past the nursery entrance minutes before the alarm. Dark uniform, broad shoulders, controlled pace. Captain Adrian Vale, Earth Alliance Exchange Protector, assigned to palace security against the wishes of half the Royal Guard. The technician swallowed. "He entered a blind zone after this, Lord Marshal." Cale's voice went cold. "And the princess?" The technician did not want to answer. Her chamber alarm triggered 90 seconds later. The search spread downward. Guards flooded stairwells, gardens, servant tunnels, old prayer rooms, and the maintenance veins beneath the palace where royal footsteps were never meant to fall. They found blood on the 3rd service level. Human blood, red and wet against white stone. Then they found a torn strip of dark earth uniform caught on a pipe bracket. By the time Cale reached the lower east passage, 30 guards already had rifles aimed into the gloom. The corridor ahead was narrow, built for servants and machines, lit only by failing emergency lamps. At the far end stood Captain Adrian Vale. His face was bruised. One eye was swelling shut. Blood ran from a cut at his temple and from a deeper wound along his side. In his arms, wrapped in a torn ceremonial cloak, was Princess Leora. Every weapon rose at once. Adrian did not raise his own. He did not even reach for it. He turned slightly, placing his body between the rifles and the child, and tightened one arm around her back as she buried her face against his shoulder. "Put her down," Cale ordered. His voice carried the kind of fury that made younger guards step aside without thinking. Adrian looked at the rifles, then at Cale. "No." The single word struck the corridor harder than a shout would have. One guard hissed. Another moved his finger closer to the trigger. Cale stepped forward. "You are holding the royal child of Vyrlia. You will place her on the floor and move away from her now." Adrian's breathing was uneven, but his voice stayed calm. "Not until I know which one of your guards is still compromised." The accusation detonated through the corridor. "Compromised," Cale repeated, as if the human had spoken filth in a holy chamber. "You abduct the heir and accuse her protectors." Adrian's eyes moved once across the guards, not in panic but in measurement. Someone opened the inner rotation before the alarm. Someone drugged her. Someone moved her through the lower service line. "I intercepted them." A captain of the Royal Guard snarled, "Liar." Princess Leora flinched at the sound and clung harder to Adrian's uniform. That small movement changed nothing for the rifles, but it changed the air. Cale saw it and hated that he saw it. "Princess," he said, forcing his voice gentler, "come to me." Leora did not lift her head. Adrian closed his eyes for half a second, as if the child's fear hurt more than his wounds. "Do not crowd her," he said quietly. "She has sedative shock." Queen Serapha Viral arrived before Cale could answer, her silver mourning armor still half-fastened from the interrupted treaty ceremony. She did not look like a queen first. She looked like a mother who had been forced to remain royal while her heart was being crushed in public. "Leora," she whispered. The child stirred, but when 2 palace guards stepped aside to clear the queen's path, Leora shook violently and whispered something into Adrian's chest. Serapha froze. "Captain Vale," she said, and the title sounded like it cost her blood. "Give me my daughter." Adrian looked at the queen with exhausted respect. "Your Majesty, I will, but not here. Not surrounded by palace guard." Kale lifted his rifle himself. "You do not set terms." Adrian shifted again, shielding the child from him. "Then shoot through me." No one moved. The queen's face went white. Kale's rifle stayed raised, but his hands had tightened around it in a way that betrayed him. Adrian looked down at the child. "Leora," he said softly, "I need you to breathe slowly, like we practiced in the tunnel." Her small fingers gripped his collar. "Don't let them take me back," she whispered, loud enough for the front rank to hear. The corridor fell silent. Adrian's face hardened, not with anger, but with the terrible focus of a man who had already chosen what he would stand in front of. Then the child lifted her tear-streaked face just enough to look at her mother and whispered, "The kind guard gave me sweet water." Then everything went dark. Kale's expression changed. Behind him, one royal guard lowered his eyes a fraction too late. By the time Captain Adrian Vale was brought into the royal judgment hall, the palace had already decided what shape the truth should have. The hall was enormous, built from pale crystal columns and black ceremonial stone, with the old crowns of Vyrlia suspended above the central floor like frozen stars. On normal days, the room was meant to make justice feel sacred. Now it felt like a cage polished beautifully enough to hide the bars. Adrian stood in the center with his wrists bound in silver restraint bands, his side still bleeding through his dark earth uniform, while Princess Leora sat behind a transparent medical screen near the queen's throne. She had finally been taken from his arms, but only after Adrian demanded that every palace guard leave the immediate chamber and only royal physicians touch her. That demand had nearly gotten him shot in the corridor. Now it made him look even more guilty. To the nobles watching from the upper tiers, it looked like control. To Adrian, it was the bare minimum required to keep a frightened child from being handed back to whoever had already reached her once. Lord Marshal Cale Thorne stood before him with a ceremonial blade resting at his side and cold fury in his eyes. "Captain Adrian Vale of Earth," he said, each word sharp enough to cut through the murmuring hall, "you were found in a restricted service corridor carrying the missing heir of the Vyrlian crown. You refused lawful orders. You accused royal guards of betrayal. You kept the princess away from her own mother. Do you deny any of this?" Adrian's face was pale from his injuries, but his voice remained steady. "No." The hall erupted. A noble in a violet shoulder mantle slammed one hand against the rail. "He admits it." Another shouted, "Earth sent a thief into our nursery." A third voice rose colder than the rest. "Punish him before his government turns this into negotiation." Queen Serapha did not speak. She sat beside Leora's medical screen, one hand pressed against the glass, watching her daughter flinch every time a guard moved too close to the platform. Cale lifted his hand and the hall quieted, though not completely. "You have one chance to explain why this court should not condemn you here." Adrian looked past him toward the queen, then toward the medical screen where Leora sat wrapped in a blanket too large for her small shoulders. "Who changed the inner door rotation before the alarm?" Cale's expression darkened. "That is not an answer," Adrian said. "It is the answer you should be looking for." Cale stepped closer. "You were seen near the chamber," Adrian answered. "Yes," Cale continued. "You entered a blind zone." Adrian said. "Yes." Cale's voice hardened. "You were found carrying the princess." Adrian said again. "Yes." Cale moved another step forward. "Then stop hiding behind fragments." Adrian's jaw tightened for the first time. "Someone altered the nursery wing's inner route 90 seconds before the alarm. Someone disabled one service lens without triggering maintenance review. Someone gave the princess sweet water mixed with a calming compound. Find who had access to all three, and you find who took her before I did." The words did not calm the court. They offended it. A senior noble leaned forward, silver eyes narrow with contempt. "Convenient. The human claims an invisible traitor exists, but only after being caught with the child." Adrian turned his head slowly. "No. I claimed it before you dragged me here. You were just too angry to listen." Cale struck him across the face before anyone could react. The blow turned Adrian's head and reopened the cut at his lip. Leora made a small terrified sound behind the medical screen. Serapha stood at once. "Cale." The marshal froze, not because he regretted the strike, but because the princess had recoiled from him, not from the human. Adrian straightened carefully and looked back at Cale. "That is the second time someone in this palace has reacted violently to a question about access logs. A royal physician emerged from behind the medical screen before Kale could answer. Her face was drawn tight with professional alarm. "Your Majesty," she said, "the child has traces of a neural calming substance in her system. Low dose, fast-acting, given orally within the last hour." The judgment hall shifted. Not loudly. Fear rarely needs volume when it enters a room that thought it was certain. Queen Serapha turned toward the physician. Could Captain Vale have given it to her? The physician hesitated. Possible, but unlikely based on timing. The compound had already begun to take effect before the corridor confrontation. Adrian closed his eyes briefly, not in relief but exhaustion. Kale's stare did not leave him. Or he gave it to her first and staged the rest. Adrian opened his eyes again. "Then why was I already wounded before your guards found me?" No one answered that cleanly. Adrian raised his bound hands as much as the restraints allowed. "Check the lower east passage. There is another trail there that is not mine. Check the nursery cup. Check the door rotation. Check who requested ceremonial traffic clearance during the treaty speech. And check which guard was allowed to bring the princess sweet water." At that phrase, Leora's head lifted. Her voice was tiny behind the glass. "The kind guard," she whispered. Every adult in the hall looked toward her. Serapha moved closer, careful and slow. "Leora, who gave you the water?" The child's eyes filled with tears. "He said I had to drink it so I would not be scared when the loud bells came." Kale turned toward his officers. "Names. Every guard with nursery access." Adrian did not look victorious. He only looked more tired. "Start with the ones everyone trusts too much." The queen looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time her rage had to share space with doubt. The judgment hall no longer sounded certain. That was the first change. Only minutes earlier, every noble voice had known exactly what Captain Adrian Vale was: thief, spy, human opportunist, threat. Now the hall had gone quieter, not peaceful, not forgiving, but uncertain in the way a room becomes uncertain when the first crack appears in a beautiful wall. Adrian stood in the center with his wrists bound, blood drying at his lip. One hand pressed lightly against the wound in his side because the restraints prevented him from applying real pressure. Across from him, Lord Marshal Kale Thorne kept his posture rigid, but his eyes had begun moving too much. The royal physician's report had not cleared the human, but it had damaged the easy story. Princess Leora had been drugged before Adrian was found with her. Someone had reached the child inside the most protected wing of the palace. Someone had moved through doors that should not have opened. Someone had made the royal court look at its own guards instead of the outsider it wanted to blame. Queen Serapha stepped down from the throne platform slowly, her silver armor catching the red emergency light. "Captain Vale," she said, voice controlled with visible effort, "you said you intercepted someone." Adrian looked at her, then toward the upper tier where the nobles watched like predators waiting for permission to believe again. "Yes, your Majesty," Kale's voice cut in. Conveniently, after entering a blind zone where no feed confirms it, Adrian turned his head toward him. The feed was not blind by accident. Kale's jaw flexed. "You keep making accusations, because your palace keeps giving me reasons." A wave of anger moved through the court, but the queen raised one hand and it died before it could become noise. "Explain everything," she said. "Not as a soldier defending himself, as a protector telling me how my daughter disappeared." Adrian breathed once, shallow and painful. "During the treaty ceremony, I was posted outside the East Gallery. I was not assigned to the nursery wing, I know that, but I noticed a servant moving against ceremony traffic." A noble scoffed. "A servant?" Adrian did not look at him. "A servant with a fresh badge, too clean for shift work, walking with the confidence of someone who knew no one would question him." Kale's eyes narrowed. "That means nothing." "Alone, no." Then I noticed the scent marker outside the nursery corridor had been changed. Several Virelians stiffened. Scent markers were not decorative in their palace. They were part of old security, subtle chemical identifiers used by the royal household. Adrian continued. "The wrong marker was placed near the inner nursery route, not enough to alert a scanner, enough to make routine patrols follow the expected path instead of the real one." The royal intelligence officer, Lady Marin, leaned forward sharply. "How would you know our scent routes?" Adrian's mouth tightened. "Because no one wanted the human protector near the royal child, so I studied every public movement pattern I could." That answer struck harder than he intended. Queen Serapha looked away for half a second. Kale did not. "Patterns do not prove a kidnapping." Adrian nodded. "No, the toy did." At that, the hall shifted again. The small moon-shaped toy had been recovered from the nursery floor and now rested in a clear evidence field beside the physician's report. Adrian looked at it. Princess Leora kept that toy on the left side of her bed during every rest period. I saw it twice from the corridor when the door opened. Tonight it was on the right side, near the cup. Kale gave a short, bitter laugh. You are asking this court to believe you risked a diplomatic crisis because a toy moved. Adrian's eyes sharpened. No, I am asking this court to understand that children build worlds in patterns adults stop seeing. Whoever staged that room knew locks and patrols. They did not know her. The words landed in a way no tactical report could have. Behind the medical screen, Leora hugged her blanket tighter. Queen Serapha turned toward her. Leora, was your moon toy near the cup? The child nodded slowly. It was wrong, she whispered. I remember because I tried to fix it, but my hands felt sleepy. The hall went still. Adrian closed his eyes once, as if the memory hurt him. I followed the service route down because that was the only path left after the inner door changed. I found a guard carrying her through the lower passage. He wore royal colors. He knew the patrol gaps. He also had a damp cloth over her mouth. Kale stepped closer. Name him. Adrian looked at the queen. I did not know his name then. Lady Marin was already working at a side console, pulling restricted access records with shaking precision. There was a ceremonial override, she said, hidden under treaty procession traffic. Inner nursery rotation changed by senior guard authority. Kale turned. Whose authority? Marin's face had lost color. Sir Valen. The name moved through the hall like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. Sir Valen was not just a guard. He was a royal inner protector, old bloodline, old oath, trusted enough to stand within arm's reach of the princess. Queen Serapha's voice was almost a whisper. Where is he? No one answered fast enough. Kale spun toward his officers. Find him. A guard at the lower door touched his communicator, listened, and then went very still. Lord Marshal, he said, Sir Valen is not in the hall. Adrian looked at Kale. Then you have less time than you think. Kale's pride fought the warning for one visible second. You expect us to trust you now. Adrian glanced toward Leora, who was staring at him through the medical screen with frightened, certain eyes. No, he said. I expect you to protect her better than your pride protects you. Before Kale could answer, every light in the judgment hall died. The emergency shutters slammed down over the exits. In the darkness, Leora screamed. Then a cold voice came over the palace speakers. Sir Valen said, for the purity of the crown, the human must not leave this room alive. The darkness inside the royal judgment hall lasted only 4 seconds, but it was long enough for old fear to become new truth. Nobles gasped. Guards shouted over one another. The transparent medical screen around Princess Leora flickered weakly, throwing pale blue light across her frightened face as Queen Serapha reached for her daughter and found the barrier still locked between them. Captain Adrian Vale moved before anyone gave him permission. Bound wrists or not, bleeding side or not, he stepped toward the princess's platform and placed himself between her and the nearest sealed entrance. Lord Marshal Kale Thorne turned on him by instinct, rifle half raised, but Adrian did not even look back. Do not aim at me, he said. Aim at the doors. Kale's jaw tightened. You are still a prisoner. Adrian's eyes stayed on the dark side corridors. Then your prisoner is the only one facing the right direction. The emergency lights came on in thin red strips along the floor. The judgment hall changed under them. Crystal columns became shadows. The suspended crowns above looked less like symbols and more like teeth. From the palace speakers, Sir Valen's voice returned, calm and ceremonial, as if he were announcing a royal banquet instead of treason. The crown has been weakened by foreign infection. Human influence has entered our halls, our treaties, our bloodline. Tonight the infection will be cut out. Queen Serapha rose slowly. Valen, she said, and grief made the name heavier than rage could have. You served my mother. I served the crown, Valen replied, not the softness wearing it. Kale moved toward the main exit, signaling 2 guards to override the lockdown. Adrian saw the side wall shift before they did. It was subtle, a hairline seam opening behind a decorative panel, exactly the kind of hidden route only palace security would know. Left wall, Adrian snapped. Kale hesitated half a second too long. The panel blew inward. 3 armored loyalists came through in black ceremonial guard gear, rifles low and ready, moving not toward the nobles, not toward the queen, but toward Leora. Adrian slammed his shoulder into the nearest guard before the man could fire. Pain tore through his side so violently that the room flashed white at the edges, but the impact knocked the rifle offline, and the shot went into the ceiling instead of the child's medical screen. Cale recovered then, fast and furious, firing twice. One attacker fell. The second ducked behind a column. The third raised a blade and drove straight for Adrian. The restraint bands on Adrian's wrists saved his life by accident. He caught the blade between the linked cuffs, twisted hard, and drove his forehead into the attacker's face. Something cracked. Not enough. The attacker punched him in the wound and Adrian dropped to one knee, breath gone. Leora screamed his name. That sound reached him before the pain could keep him down. He rolled under the next strike, hooked one bound arm behind the attacker's knee, and dragged him into Cale's line of fire. Cale took the shot. The guard fell against the floor hard enough to shake the medical platform. For one sharp second, Cale and Adrian looked at each other across the body of the traitor. Neither man thanked the other. There was no time. Adrian only said, "More will come through the lower choir passage." Cale barked to his guards, "Cover the choir doors." Then with visible bitterness he added, "Listen to him." That order changed the hall more than the gunfire had. Nobles who had called for Adrian's execution minutes earlier began moving where he pointed. Servants dragged benches into barricades. A royal physician released medical vapor across the floor after Adrian told her Virelian scent trackers would follow Leora's fear response. Lady Marin unlocked the old security shutters with trembling hands. Queen Serapha knelt beside the medical screen, speaking softly to her daughter while Adrian and Cale turned the judgment hall into a defensive room. "Your Majesty," Adrian said, "do not stand in front of the glass." Serapha looked at him, still torn between shame and terror. "She is my child. Then stay alive where she can see you." The next breach came through the choir doors, exactly where Adrian said it would. Valen's loyalists entered in disciplined pairs, shields raised, trying to cut a path to the princess before loyal palace forces could reach the hall from outside. Cale met them with royal guards, but the loyalists had planned the room. They knew where the columns gave cover. They knew which floor plates hid service locks. They knew the royal guard firing angles. Adrian saw the pattern and understood why Valen had needed him blamed. A human kidnapper would be simple. An internal conspiracy would make every noble question the old families that held the palace together. He dragged himself to the evidence table, smashed the field casing with his cuffed hands, and threw the moon-shaped toy toward Leora. It slid through the weakening medical screen and landed beside her. "Hold that," he said. "Eyes on me. Breathe slow." Valen entered last, helmet removed, silver hair immaculate, face untouched by the chaos he had caused. His gaze moved from the queen to Leora, then settled on Adrian with disgust. "Still standing, human." Adrian's breath came rough. "Still in your way." Valen drew a narrow royal blade. "You should have let history correct itself." Adrian stepped fully in front of the princess's platform, blood dripping from his fingers, cuffs still locked around his wrists. "No," he said quietly. "You touched a child and called it history." Valen's expression hardened. Behind Adrian, Leora whispered through tears, "Protector." The word was small, but it reached every corner of the hall. Cale heard it. Serapha heard it. So did the nobles. And when Valen lunged, Adrian moved to meet him before anyone else could. Valen moved like a man who had practiced killing inside royal rooms. There was no wasted motion, no wild anger, no dramatic shout. He came forward with the narrow blade low and his left hand open, ready to trap Adrian Vale's bound wrists and finish him before the court could understand what was happening. Adrian met him without enough blood in his body and without enough room to fail. The first strike slid past his ribs because he turned into the pain instead of away from it. The second caught the restraint chain between his wrists and sparked against the silver links. Adrian stepped in close, too close for proper sword work, and drove his shoulder into Valen's chest. Both men hit the floor hard. Leora screamed behind the medical screen. Queen Serapha shouted something, but the sound disappeared under gunfire as Valen's loyalists pushed harder through the choir doors. Lord Marshal Cale Thorne tried to reach Adrian, but 3 traitor guards pinned him behind a fallen crystal column. "Vale!" he shouted. Adrian heard him, but Valen's elbow struck his jaw and turned the room sideways. He rolled before the blade came down, felt it cut through the side of his uniform, and kicked Valen's knee hard enough to break his balance. Valen staggered back, not badly hurt but offended. "This is why your species poisons every alliance," he hissed. "You make savagery look loyal." Adrian forced himself upright, one hand pressed to his bleeding side. "Funny," he said through his teeth. I was about to say the same about treason. Valen's eyes narrowed. Then he lifted 2 fingers and every traitor in the hall changed direction at once. They stopped trying to kill the guards. They started moving toward the princess. Adrian saw the shift before anyone named it. "Kale, they are not fighting you anymore," he shouted. "They are making a lane." Kale looked once and understood. His face changed, not with fear, but with the anger of a commander realizing he had been reading the wrong battlefield. Royal Guard collapse inward, protect the child. The loyal guards obeyed, but the traitors had planned for that too. A side panel opened near the medical platform. A small kill drone, no larger than a serving tray, unfolded from the wall and turned its red lens toward Leora. Serapha threw herself against the medical screen. "No," Adrian moved before the drone fired. He crossed the space in 3 brutal steps, slammed his bound wrists around the drone's body, and dragged it down against his chest as it discharged. The shot hit him instead of the princess. It burned through his shoulder and dropped him to one knee. For a moment, the hall stopped breathing. Leora pressed both hands against the glass. "Adrian," he looked up at her, face pale, mouth tight with pain. "Eyes on me," he whispered. "Breathe slow, just like the tunnel." She tried. She was crying too hard, but she tried. That mattered. Serapha stared at the human kneeling between her daughter and death, and whatever remained of her doubt finally broke. "Release his restraints," she ordered. Kale turned sharply. "Your Majesty, now." Lady Marin scrambled to the control panel and entered the override. The bands around Adrian's wrists fell open. He barely noticed. He picked up the broken drone with his good hand, ripped out its tracking core, and threw it to Kale. "They are using her scent marker and pulse signature. Destroy anything that tracks royal blood." Kale caught the core and looked at him with something that was not trust yet but was no longer suspicion. "How do you know that?" Adrian pushed himself to his feet. "Because if I wanted to kill her in a locked palace, I would make the palace aim for me." Kale's eyes hardened. "That is a disturbing sentence. Useful one, though." For the first time, Kale almost smiled. Then Valen came again. This time Adrian did not meet him alone. Kale stepped beside him, blade drawn, shoulder armor cracked, silver blood on his cheek. "You protect the child," Kale said. "I will take Valen." Adrian shook his head. "No, he knows your rhythm. He trained in your halls. He expects honor." Kale looked at him. "And what do you expect?" Adrian's eyes stayed on Valen. "To be underestimated." Valen lunged between them, fast and precise, but Adrian dropped low, not away from the blade, under it. Kale struck high at the same instant. Valen blocked Kale, exactly as Adrian predicted, and Adrian drove the broken drone casing into Valen's wrist with all the strength he had left. The royal blade fell. Kale kicked it away. The traitors made one final push. Adrian turned from Valen and saw the last assassin break through the barricade, rifle raised toward Leora through the failing medical screen. He did not think. Thinking was too slow. He ran, hit the assassin from the side, and took the shot through his upper back as they crashed into the floor. The rifle skidded away. The assassin did not rise. Adrian tried to, but his arms failed. The hall went silent except for alarms and Leora sobbing. Valen was on his knees now, Kale's blade at his throat, his perfect hair fallen across his face. Serapha reached the medical screen as it finally dissolved and pulled Leora into her arms. The child clung to her mother for 1 second, then looked past her to the human bleeding on the floor. "Please," she whispered, "help my protector." For several seconds, no one in the Royal Judgment Hall moved toward Captain Adrian Vale. That was the shame of it, and every noble in the room would remember it later. They had watched him fall. They had watched the human they had called thief, spy, beast, and invader take a shot meant for their princess. And still, for one terrible breath, the old fear remained stronger than gratitude. Then Princess Leora broke free from her mother's arms and ran. Queen Serapha reached for her, but the child was already crossing the broken floor, past fallen guards, shattered crystal, burned banners, and blood that was not all human. Leora dropped to her knees beside Adrian and placed both small hands against his face. "Wake up," she whispered. "You said we had to breathe slow. You have to do it too." Adrian's eyes opened a fraction. His lips moved, but no sound came. Leora leaned closer. "Please," she said, "I'm safe. You can stop now." That sentence did what no command could. The hall came alive. Royal physicians rushed forward with emergency kits. Loyal guards dragged the last traitors into restraints. Lord Marshal Kale Thorne stood over Sir Valen with his blade still at the traitor's throat, but his eyes were fixed on Adrian. Keep him alive, Kale ordered, and this time no one questioned why the marshal was giving orders for a human prisoner. A physician cut open Adrian's uniform and went pale at the wound in his back. He should not have been standing. Another medic pressed a sealant pad to his shoulder. He should not have been breathing. Adrian coughed once, wet and painful, and managed to turn his head toward the princess. Is she hurt? The physician looked at him as if he had misunderstood reality itself. You are the one dying. Adrian's gaze stayed on Leora. Answer the question. Serapha knelt beside her daughter, voice breaking under the weight of everything she had nearly lost. No, Captain, she is not hurt. Only then did Adrian's body loosen, as if he had been holding himself together by duty alone. Valen laughed once from the floor, soft and poisonous even with Kale's blade against his throat. Look at them, he said, grieving over a human like trained animals. This is how it begins. First pity, then dependence, then the crown kneels to earth. Kale struck him across the face with the flat of the blade hard enough to silence him. The crown nearly died because of you, he said. Valen spat silver blood onto the crystal floor. I acted before the queen sold us to soft alliances. Serapha rose slowly. She still held Leora's hand, but her face had changed. Grief remained, fear remained, but behind both was royal anger, cold and ancient. You drugged my child. Valen lifted his chin. I preserved the bloodline. The queen's voice dropped to a whisper that reached every corner of the hall. No, you used a child as a weapon and called it loyalty. Kale signaled 2 guards. Take him alive. Every name, every house, every coin behind him will be pulled into daylight. Valen's eyes flicked toward the nobles, and several of them looked away too quickly. Adrian noticed because even half-conscious, he was still watching the room. Kale saw him notice. That small shared recognition became the first true bridge between them. The marshal stepped closer as the physicians worked. Captain Vale, he said stiffly, I owe you an apology. Adrian breathed through the pain and forced the ghost of a smile. Start with better nursery security. Kale stared at him, then gave a short, stunned laugh that sounded almost like surrender. You are impossible. Adrian closed his eyes. Been said. The public inquiry began before Adrian was fully lifted onto a medical sled, because Leora refused to let them take him away until everyone heard her. The queen did not stop her. The nobles gathered in broken silence. The royal guards lowered their weapons. Lady Marin activated the official record. Kale stood beside the princess, his voice gentler than anyone in the court had ever heard it. Princess Leora, he said, you must answer clearly. Did Captain Adrian Vale take you from your room? Leora looked at Adrian on the medical sled, at the blood on his uniform, at the torn restraint bands lying on the floor, and then at the court that had almost killed him. Her small voice shook, but it did not break. No, Kale asked. Then what happened? Leora swallowed. The kind guard gave me sweet water. I got sleepy. He carried me into the dark. I was scared. Then Adrian found me. He fought him. He held me so I would not fall. He told me to breathe. He said not all quiet places are safe, but we could be clever. The hall was silent enough to hear the medical sled hum. Kale lowered his head. Then what is Captain Vale to you? Leora stepped closer to Adrian and rested one hand on the edge of the sled. He is not a thief, she said. He is my protector. No one moved for a long moment. Then Kale placed his fist over his heart and bowed to the human. One by one, the royal guards followed. Then the physicians. Then servants. Then, reluctantly and with visible shame, the nobles. Queen Serapha was last, not because she hesitated, but because when she bowed, she did it fully. Captain Adrian Vale, she said, by crown authority, you are cleared of all accusation. By a mother's debt, you have my gratitude. By royal decree, you are named Shield of the Crown Child, first human to hold the honor. Adrian opened one eye. Does it come with medical leave? Leora laughed through tears. Serapha smiled, broken and grateful. And the court that had feared what humans might take finally learned what one human was willing to stand in front of.